I first encountered her lying still under a broken red gate at an old forest shrine, half concealed in some weeds. Her fur was dirty and tangled with mud and pine needles, and her body was so thin it looked like it might disappear entirely. You could see each rib protruding beneath her torn skin, almost as if her bones were trying to escape. As I stepped closer, her head twitched slightly, and that's when I noticed them. 3 tiny kittens snuggled against her, so small that they could fit in the palm of my hand, their soft cries reminiscent of leaves rustling in the breeze. I had come to this peaceful part of Totori seeking quiet, hoping to immerse myself in the slower pace of village life. However, silence often speaks in its own way, and that morning it was anything but calm. At that moment, I didn't know their names or how long she had been struggling to keep them alive. But I realized, almost instinctively, that if I walked away, they wouldn't survive the night. And perhaps, in some sense, I would feel that loss as well. The shrine was about 2 kilometers from my home, partially hidden by trees, with moss creeping over stone steps and cedar branches obscuring the sky. I had passed it many times before, always thinking it was just another forgotten sight. Yet that day, it transformed into something sacred for an entirely different reason. Crouching down slowly, my heart raced. I was afraid I might frighten her, or worse, confirm my deepest fears. The mother's eyes slowly opened. They were dull and unfocused, yet carried a fierce, instinctive fire. She remained still, but her gaze felt like a warning. Don't come any closer to my babies. In contrast, the kittens were restless. One was trying to climb onto her back, another was hiding beneath her paw, and the smallest was trembling, breathing in quick, anxious gasps. I had no gloves, no food, and no carrier, just a frayed canvas bag and a racing heartbeat. I leaned in and spoke softly, hoping they could sense my gentle intention. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The mother wasn't convinced. She hissed, her lips curling back to reveal her few remaining teeth. It wasn't a loud sound. It seemed strained, worn out, but it was enough to make me freeze. That moment hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. I wasn't sure if reaching out to her could cause further harm. Should I even attempt it? But then, the smallest kitten crawled toward me. Acting on impulse, I reached out my hand, slowly and cautiously. As the kitten brushed against my fingers, its fur felt damp and sticky. It made a sound, a gentle noise, almost like it was asking for help. I carefully picked it up and placed it in my satchel, wrapping it with the flannel shirt I had intended to wear later. The mother cat attempted to stand but collapsed instead. At that moment, I felt something inside me break. I grabbed my phone and called Emiko, who used to run the only veterinary clinic in the nearby town before her retirement. She answered without hesitation and instructed me to bring all of them to her clinic. "Be gentle. Don't talk. Keep them warm," she advised. Gathering the other kittens was surprisingly easy, almost as if they could sense they were being taken somewhere safe. However, lifting the mother cat felt different, like I was handling something precious. Her body was hot with fever, and her breathing was erratic. I honestly wasn't sure she would make it through the ride. When we arrived at Emiko's, my instincts took over. Blankets were spread out, fluids were prepared, and a heat lamp was placed over a cardboard box. The kittens huddled close, their wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Then Toma, my neighbor, appeared. Arms crossed and a deep frown etched on his face, he grumbled, "You're bringing strays into your house now? Don't let them get too comfortable." I didn't respond, not at that moment. The mother cat was still alive, just barely. Despite Emiko's warning not to get my hopes up, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope inside me. 2 days passed. Emiko named the mother Shizu, and she continued to cling to life, though it was evident she was barely hanging on. She hadn't eaten or moved much, while the kittens instinctively nursed from her. Yet, it was obvious she was running on something deeper than physical strength. Some fierce, dying love for her little ones. Then came the 3rd night. I had fallen asleep in the corner of Emiko's spare room, with the cardboard box right beside me. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a scratching sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized Shizu was dragging herself out of the box, her legs quaking, her body fragile. She wasn't moving toward me. She was trying to escape. Halfway to the door, she collapsed. I rushed to her side just as Emiko, barefoot and groggy, entered the room. "This might be it," she said softly. Yet there was no panic in her voice, just a calm acceptance born from witnessing too many animals pass away. We carefully laid her back down, but that night did not bring death. The twist came the following morning. Emiko discovered that Shizu had been tagged. Under the fur behind her ear lay a faint tattoo, nearly worn away, a number. This cat had once belonged to someone. Someone had let her go. Emiko mentioned that the number connected to an illegal breeder who had been shut down years ago. This made Shizu more than just a stray. She represented a life that had been cast aside by a system that often fails animals. The rescue mission became more than a matter of survival. It turned into a quest for justice. In the kitchen, Emiko held the tag number written on a slip of paper, her hand hovering nervously over the old landline phone. The morning light streamed through the rice paper windows, painting a soft golden hue across the tatami floor where the kittens lay nestled together, breathing in a calm and innocent rhythm. Shizu was still alive, though barely. Her breath was faint, and her eyes, once darting around in fear, were now peacefully shut. Yet her story was filled with shadows of violence, abandonment, and long periods of suffering hidden behind locked doors. The image of her being bred and abandoned, left to suffer under a shrine gate, weighed heavily on me. That afternoon, Toma visited again. His steps seemed heavier, and his expression was harder to read. He glanced at the kittens without saying a word, then moved to the edge of the porch to light a cigarette, letting the smoke fade into the open air. I didn't expect him to show any sympathy, but then he spoke, and his words struck a nerve. "Are you thinking of keeping them, or just dragging them through more dying?" There wasn't malice in his tone, but the weight of his words spoke to a deeper understanding of pain, perhaps coming from his own past experiences. I didn't respond right away, not because I didn't have thoughts to share, but because I was overwhelmed. Inside me, I felt a shift beginning, a tension between choosing the easy path and making a choice that would resonate deeply in my heart. News of the rescue spread quickly, faster than I anticipated. By the 5th day, whispers floated through the village like a gentle wind through the bamboo groves, soft but constant. When I entered the corner store, I noticed 2 elderly women pause their conversation, their gazes directed at me, brief yet piercing. A boy I didn't recognize pointed at my coat pocket, where Miso liked to snuggle, and asked if I was starting my own zoo. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was simply the discomfort that arises in tight-knit communities when something new disrupts familiar routines. However, the biggest change came when the landlord showed up unexpectedly. He stood just outside the porch, clipboard in hand, with an exaggerated smile plastered across his face. "I've been hearing about the animals," he said, his voice calm and steady. "This place wasn't really meant for pets, especially not several." His gaze shifted toward the box Emiko had set up under the kotatsu, where Nori peeked out, a mix of curiosity and defiance in her posture. I tried to reason with him, but it was clear he had concerns about damage and responsibility, practical worries that made the conversation feel less harsh. Later that evening, Emiko prepared tea in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, carrying a weight that wasn't sadness but something more serious. "They'll need a decision soon, a home, a future. Otherwise, someone else will make that choice for them." Her words hung in the air. Like a second pot of tea, neither of us was ready to pour. That night, as the rain softly tapped against the tin roof, I sat crossed-legged next to the cardboard box, watching the kittens sleep. Kiko had snuggled up to my leg earlier, purring softly, a gentle rhythm that felt comforting. Miso was curled against her mother, so small that I worried she might vanish if I blinked too quickly. Shizu, however, seemed different. Although her breathing was steady, her eyes told a different story. When she opened them, they held a depth of weariness, as if she were weighing the value of staying in this world. I found myself questioning, was I doing this for them or for me? The thought of letting them go, to a shelter, to the unknown, felt like losing a part of myself. But what if keeping them meant tying them to a life that I wasn't ready to provide? My days had been quiet before they arrived, predictable, comfortable. Now, my life revolved around feeding schedules, careful baths, and the heavy sense of responsibility that came with their care. Emiko often said that the heart makes promises that the hands might struggle to fulfill. I didn't respond then, because deep down, I understood she was right. And still, I wasn't prepared to confront the decision ahead. By the 9th day, the kittens had started playing again. Tentative steps over folded blankets, sudden bursts of energy across the wooden floor, tiny paws batting at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Shizu, though still fragile and slow, had begun to raise her head, her gaze following their movements, as if she was truly engaging with the world around her. For the first time, I allowed myself to think. Maybe they were going to be okay. That hopeful thought shattered the very next morning. The back door stood slightly open, just wide enough for a determined little creature to slip out. I didn't notice right away. It wasn't until I reached for Nori's food bowl and found it empty that a rush of alarm filled me. Suddenly, I was searching every corner of the house, every shadow in the hallway, even behind cabinets. But there was no sign of him. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground wet and muddy, with paw prints scattered across the porch in every direction. We spent hours looking for him in the woods, calling out his name until we could barely speak. Emiko stayed calm and focused during the search, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, a worry she didn't express. Toma arrived partway through, silently handing me a flashlight as if we could find him with a beam of light. As night fell and Nori still hadn't come back, something shifted within me. The illusion of control I thought I had started to fade away. I lay awake long after midnight, with the door still slightly ajar, listening for sounds that never came. One kitten lost, one connection broken. All I could do was wait, for him to return or for my guilt to set in deeper. In the days that passed after Nori's disappearance, the house took on a quietness that felt both heavy and alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every breeze rustling through the bamboo outside, made me glance toward the door, with my heart balancing between hope and worry. The other kittens seemed subdued at first, huddling closer together while they slept, rarely straying far from their mother. Even Shizu, who had started to eat soft food from Emiko's hand, spent long hours staring toward the porch, as if she awaited something, or someone's return. To fill the silence, I found myself talking to them more often. I narrated my mornings, reading whatever book happened to be nearby to break the stillness. Kiko would climb into my lap, resting her tiny head under my chin, purring rhythmically in a way that changed the atmosphere around us. Miso trailed after me from room to room, dragging her stuffed mouse by the tail, her gaze fixed on me without blinking. They had become more than just pets. They were woven into my daily routine, influencing the choices I hadn't yet made. I found myself hesitating to respond to calls or emails that hinted at a return to my old life. Emiko picked up on my changing demeanor. One evening she said simply, "They're changing you." I wanted to argue, but the truth felt too close to deny. I hadn't just saved them, I had let them fill a void I hadn't realized was there. With Nori still missing and no updates from the local shelters or villagers, it felt like our growing bond was fragile, like we were pretending that our family was whole. None of us knew how long we could keep up that act. On the 12th day, Emiko asked the question I'd been avoiding, much like steering clear of a sharp edge. We were outside, sheltered from the rain that dripped steadily from the roof. Inside, Shizu was asleep with Miso curled up next to her, while Kiko entertained herself with a ribbon tied around a bag of rice. Emiko didn't look at me as she spoke, just continued sipping her tea in a soft voice. "If they stay, they'll need more than your heart. They'll need a life you haven't built yet." Her words didn't hurt. Instead, they landed with a weight that felt honest, yet heavy. I looked toward the tree line, still hoping Nori might emerge from the shadows, but he didn't. That thought pressed on my mind. Was I holding on to the others because I loved them, or because I feared losing more? That evening, Toma arrived carrying something wrapped in cloth, an old wooden box holding a faded collar. Found it at the edge of the creek. Thought it might be his. He didn't need to mention Nori's name, it was understood. I took the box gently, cradling it as if it might still hold warmth. Later, after everyone left, I sat beside Shizu and whispered the only truth I had left. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Yet I also understood that keeping them meant stepping into a life I wasn't ready for, while letting them go would lead to regret. Either choice would cost me something I could never recover. The next day, after Toma had brought the collar, I found myself standing in front of the village shelter. It was a small concrete building at the edge of the nearby town, surrounded by wire fences and forgotten toys. The air inside was a mix of disinfectant and hopelessness. A receptionist handed me a clipboard without asking any questions. She likely recognized the look of someone caught between love and practicality. I stared at the blank intake forms for what felt like an eternity, but I couldn't bring myself to write down their names, not even one. When I returned home, Emiko was already packing supplies, extra food, soft bedding, and refills of medication she had quietly ordered. She didn't ask where I'd been. She gave me a look, a deep and understanding one, like a silent exchange between friends who don't need to speak to know each other's thoughts. "I can handle them," she said, "if you can't." There was no judgment in her tone, no pressure, just an open space for me to express what I wanted or to step back without feeling ashamed. But my voice didn't come. Instead, I bent down next to Shizu, my hand brushing against her fur where her ribs were no longer visible. She leaned into my touch, her eyes still closed, an act of trust that hit me harder than any confrontation could. The kittens were sleeping soundly, except for Kiko, who stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, as if she was waiting for the words I still hadn't found. In the woods behind the house, a crow called out, its sound sharp and final, like a soft ending giving way to something more permanent. I still hadn't made my choice, but deep down I knew I wouldn't find peace until I did. The next morning arrived slowly, draped in a gray light that felt indecisive, hanging between a storm and quiet. I watched the light seep into the room, illuminating the corners where shadows clung. Kiko was the first to stir, stretching by my leg before curling up against my side, as if afraid to ask a question that hovered in the air. I hadn't moved all night. I just couldn't. Every time I tried to drift off, the sound of that clipboard sliding across the shelter counter echoed in my mind, the weight of my uncertainty pressing down more heavily than any answer. Emiko was already in the garden, sleeves rolled up, kneeling as she worked the soil with the skill of someone who knows when to act and when to wait. She glanced up once, offered a small nod, and went back to removing weeds. She wasn't about to press me again. The choice was mine now, unspoken but palpable. I looked at Shizu, curled protectively around Miso. Her breathing was slow but steadily stronger. Somehow she sensed my gaze and opened her eyes, which held no fear or urgency anymore, just a calm presence. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She had survived, and now she simply existed. And in that moment, it became clear that was what mattered most. When the knock came, it caught me off guard. Toma stood at the door, his face hard to read. He didn't come inside. Instead, he handed me a worn envelope. Inside were photos, faded and water-damaged, depicting another litter, another time, another regret. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Sometimes, other people's silence can guide us toward the choices we already sense we need to make. My decision wasn't like something out of a movie, all dramatic with swelling music. It was quieter and more gradual, emerging from somewhere deep inside me before I even found the words to express it. I stepped out onto the porch with Kiko snuggled in my jacket, her tiny claws gently clutching the fabric near my collarbone. The breeze carried the familiar scents of damp cedar and moist earth. In the distance, a bird I couldn't identify repeated its call, as if trying to recollect something important. I found Emiko engrossed in her gardening. She didn't look up, and I didn't ask for her thoughts. I simply spoke what was on my mind, like a breath escaping my lips. "They stay, if they'll have me." Emiko paused, not for effect, but to acknowledge the significance of my words. A faint smile crept onto her face before she returned to her digging. Later that day, I cleared the back room, setting up soft bedding, old sweaters, and a clean dish of water. I gently carried Shizu there. She didn't resist, blinking slowly and calmly, as if she understood the change happening around us. In that moment, the house transformed. It felt different, not heavier or louder, but fuller. It was no longer just a place to sleep. It became a space filled with promise, formed in quietness without any formal agreements. Yet as evening came and the kittens snuggled close, a thought lingered in my mind. Someone was still absent. Nori's absence had shifted from a painful reminder to a shape I learned to navigate, like a room with one door sealed shut. Sometimes we keep that door unlocked, just in case. Rescue stories don't always end with images of a happy cat basking in sunlight or a flawless home filled with new toys. Some conclude in a hushed room, a heartbeat alongside your own, and the understanding that you stepped into a complex and meaningful situation and chose to remain. Weeks went by, and the kittens became stronger, louder, more adventurous, bursting with energy. Miso discovered how to scramble up chair legs, while Kiko often curled up in my laundry basket, finding comfort on top of my shirts. Shizu began to gain weight, reclaiming a dignity she hadn't lost but had buried deep down. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now followed me with a calm watchfulness, as if she was also learning the true meaning of trust. I never truly stopped searching for Nori. I still left bowls out beneath the porch and kept the door slightly ajar on clear nights. I can see him peeking out from the trees, curious and wild, unlike the others around him. People often ask if I'll take on another rescue. Honestly, I'm not sure. This one came unexpectedly, just like many important moments in life do. What I've realized is that love doesn't always show up with clear signs. Sometimes it arrives when you're tired, when you feel a gentle weight beside you after a long day. It can leave marks, but it can also make you feel more complete than you were before. So if you're watching this and reflecting on your own choices, think about what you might carry if you didn't have to. Did this story resonate with you? Perhaps it reminded you of a special memory or made you pause for a moment. Remember, you're not alone in this. These subtle, meaningful rescues may not make the news, but they can transform lives, often in surprising ways. If you've ever welcomed an animal in need into your home or heart, I'd love to hear your experience. Feel free to share it in the comments. And if you know someone who understands the journey of nurturing something fragile, share this video with them. If you're interested in more stories like this, honest and real, think about subscribing. There's more to come. It might not always be neat, but it will always be genuine. Thank you for being here. And no matter where you are, keep your heart open, just in case.